At this point in the Metro timeline, we fans thought we had this all figured out. Sure, Metro Last Light may have made some small tweaks to the formula and added some more action-heavy elements to that core experience, but it was still very much a recognizable entry in the series. You could conceivably take gameplay snippets from both games in the franchise so far, and most people would likely have issues pointing out which was which. So when whispers about a third Metro title hit the internet, most of us thought we had a pretty solid idea of what we might get, and, well, we were all dead wrong. I hope you guys have an open mind because things this time around will be drastically different from what you might have been used to, but don't worry. Underneath what is seemingly a brand new exterior beats the heart of a very familiar formula. Stalkers, welcome to the Metro.
Artyom, the only thing I can hear is that Geiger counter ticking.
After two well-received releases, the team at 4A Games was riding pretty high, and deservedly so. Fans across the globe were enthralled with the world these guys had made real, and to be totally honest, most of us had expected them to return to that well-worn ground for the next release in the series. After all, their work had already proven itself in the eyes of the fan base and financial backers alike. We Metro fans were getting exactly what we wanted up until this point, and I doubt anyone would have complained if they would have given us just a little more of that same familiar gameplay. But guaranteed financial gains be damned, 4A had no intentions of manufacturing a cookie-cutter experience. From the outset, Exodus was planned to be a pretty radical departure. The original idea was to finally open up the entire Moscow Metro system to players in a more open-world type of scenario, but it wasn't long till that setting started to feel a little cramped for the team. Instead of re-rendering old locations, which by the way would have been amazing to see, 4A decided to take this thing on the road, or I guess on the rails would be more fitting. And as you would expect, a radical shift from a strictly linear experience to a wide-open one meant a whole lot of Metro mainstays would need to be reworked. And ironically, speaking of things being reworked, this game pulled a Resident Evil 1.5 and scrapped a nearly complete build of the game after going a bit too far with the whole open world thing. The original idea was to have the player lead a massive amount of people through the irradiated Russian wasteland in an attempt at having Artyom basically take his entire home station with him when he left the Metro. The game's main mode of transportation, the Aurora, instead of being a home to the few Spartans who were smart enough to leave Moscow, would house 100 or so people, and their well-being would be a reflection on how well the player was doing. Now, this lost build of the game sounds like it would have been killer to actually play, but it's not like the Exodus we got our hands on would be devoid of that same ambitious zeal anyways. In order to accommodate all these changes, the original 4A engine that powered 2033 and Last Light would be heavily modified, and to be honest, this was the most interesting factoid I came across while doing research. We'll definitely get into specifics a bit later when we cover the game's presentation, but suffice it to say, Exodus is almost unrecognizable when you compare it to the other games in the series. Of course, there are some very familiar visual quirks, like throwing knives having to spawn into reality after the animation is completed, but aside from a few things only hardcore fans would notice, this game is a massive leap forward, and if you would have told me this was a totally new engine built from the ground up to support all these innovations, I would have totally bought it. But hey, game engines and development are fun as hell to talk about, but the core of the Metro experience has always been its story, so how does that aspect hold up? Metro Exodus is a lot like Last Light in the sense that it takes cues from its literary counterpart, Metro 2035, but is mostly its own separate story. When the franchise's first entry, Metro 2033, first came out, I found myself in love with its story and decided to read the book it was based on, and I have no problems admitting by the time I got to the last page, I developed even more respect for the game. It was crazy to me just how faithful they had been when adapting that story into a video game. Nearly every major plot point was at least touched on, and I had hoped that would be the case moving forward. I will admit I was a bit disappointed when Last Light strayed from the Metro 2034 story, but I understood why that might have been a necessary move. Here with Metro Exodus, 4A took a similar approach, only using big plot points from the book and taking a sort of similar but mostly different direction from the one Glukowski originally wrote, which is a damn shame since 2035 is one hell of a story, but I gotta say, I may actually like Exodus's take on things a little more. The book, keeping with Metro tradition, is much darker with an entire long section being dedicated to the enslavement of a main character. Now that's not to say Exodus is all sunshine and rainbows, because it's definitely not, but it is much less bleak by comparison. I think we might be getting ahead of ourselves though, so let's get down to business. Exodus starts out, as usual, by putting us in the shoes of our favorite Russian mute, Artyom. In the time between Last Light's good ending and now, it seems like our guy has been obsessed with the idea of getting out of the Metro and trying to get in contact with possible survivors. He goes to the surface as much as he can, and that means putting himself in harm's way pretty damn often. After taking some serious damage and having countless blood transfusions due to the surface's intense radiation, Commander Miller, who's rocking a cool set of bionic legs after Last Light's ending by the way, gets on Artyom's ass about being more responsible and letting his dream of a world outside the Metro go. In the interim, Artyom and Anna have gotten hitched, and while she does support her husband and wants him to find what he's looking for, she's not exactly confident he ever will. Oh, and sort of unrelated, but in this entry, Artyom's fellow Spartans are given way more screen time, and this was a great move in my opinion. As the game goes on, each of these elite fighters gets at least a bit of character development, and overall, they're just really cool characters to have around. Anyways, like I said, Commander Miller isn't exactly happy about Artyom's trips to the surface and sternly suggests that he puts a stop to them, an order he almost immediately disobeys when him and Anna head to the streets of Moscow once again about a week later to see if he can get any hits on his radio. As they head back to the Metro, they notice a working train just riding the rails as if the world hadn't ended, which is something obviously neither of them have seen running on the surface. Oh, and by the way, what comes next is a bit of a revelation. I mean, it does happen in the first 15 minutes of the game, but you could call it a spoiler for the beginning of this game and the middle of the book Metro 2035, so if that is an issue for you, I'll have links in the description along with the YouTube chapters that should help you skip past it. Alright, so moving on, Artyom and Anna stumble across what might as well be a relic from another time, and in an attempt at getting a closer look, run into some Hansa troops who seem to want to help. They're taken into a car where they find a couple who claim they came from somewhere outside of Moscow. Something that, as far as they're concerned, shouldn't even be possible, since anyone with even the slightest modicum of power in the Metro had been telling everyone that the whole of Russia, and maybe even the world, had been wiped out in the nuclear war 20 some odd years ago. A story that, might I add, mostly everyone believes in. But before our lovebirds could get any more info from the two, the Hansa soldiers stop the car and proceed to plug the two travelers right there on the spot. So Artyom, in his typical fashion, tries to intervene and takes a round of 7.62 to the face for his trouble. Lucky for us, he somehow survives the shot, but these dummies don't know that, so they leave him for dead in a ditch that has clearly been used for this exact purpose many times in the past. Artyom, having escaped death for the 30th time in the last 2 or 3 years, makes his way to Hansa's outpost, which is also where the train from before was headed. After sneaking in, he gets a little assistance from the train's conductor, who's sick and tired of Hansa's idea of hospitality.
Enough of your whining, you old fuck!
Thanks to his new friend's help, Artyom's able to rescue Anna, but the trio get into a bit of a scuffle with the commander of the outpost, where it's revealed that not only are there survivors out there beyond the Moscow metro system, but Hansa has been actively using radio jammers to keep that fact a secret. Whatever's left of the Russian command structure seems to think that any contact with the outside world might let their enemies know that there are still people in Moscow, and thus might provoke another even deadlier nuclear bombardment. So now, equal parts excited and disappointed by the news they just heard, our trio decide the only way out of here is to snag that train for themselves, and that's exactly what they do. Which obviously draws just a bit of attention and ironically results in Artyom's own Spartan unit joining the Hansa forces and trying to subdue them. As soon as the Spartans realize who they've caught up with, they refuse orders to execute them, and we find out that Anna's dad and our commanding officer Miller knew about this plot twist from the start. Artyom takes care of their pursuers with a little sabotage, and the group finally gets to drill Miller on his involvement in this cover-up. He reveals that every major group in the Metro, including the Nazis and Communist Red Line, are under the control of the remnants of the Russian government. This shadow organization apparently approached Miller after the battle for D6 at the end of Last Light and clued him into the fact that what's left of the country's high command are hiding in Russia's Ural mountain range, God I hope I said that right, and that if any of this goes out, it would mean a death sentence for anyone who found out, including himself. Which perfectly explains why Hansa were picking up travelers coming into Moscow and plugging them before they got a chance to tell anyone that the war kind of ended 20 years ago for the rest of the world. Now, finally having your lifelong dream of seeing the outside world come to fruition is nice and all, but our little ranger crew just placed the sword of Damocles over their heads. Meaning none of them can ever return to Moscow, and if they try, they'll be facing the business end of a firing squad. So with no other option, Commander Miller decides to take a chance by heading to the secret bunker that's supposed to be housing the government, or I guess what's left of it. So our motley crew sets off on the most epic road trip ever planned, and as you would expect, run into more than a few roadblocks along the way, both figuratively and literally. On their travels, they come across a few more passengers to add to their growing convoy, and something about this just feels so appropriate for Metro at this point in the series. I mean, don't get me wrong, the small, confined nature of the Moscow Metro and its claustrophobia-inducing tunnels were an amazing place to tell a dark and desolate story, but actually showing the outside world that may or may not have existed as far as we were concerned at the time feels like a proper payoff for everything we went through. Kind of like Metro 2033 and Last Light, while being their own stories, were actually just steps leading to this point. All of this sort of puts a bow on the series, and I just really appreciate it. Now, it certainly could be argued that Metro started out in the tunnels and that's how it developed its fan base, so that's how it should stay, but things do evolve, and believe me, the last guy who wants to admit that is the dummy who spent a decade on YouTube talking about how Resident Evil sold out by doing something kinda similar to this. An opinion I very much still have, by the way. Now, for those of you who think the series should have continued how it started, I do understand where you're coming from, I promise, but I still think this was the right move. I mean, sure, there's definitely untread ground to cover in that original setting. I mean, they never even touched on the existence of Metro 2, or at least not significantly, and that's something that plays a big role in the books, which would be amazing to see up close. But to be honest, the move to the world that exists above ground isn't as radical as you might think at first. Much like the first two Metro titles, the story in Exodus will have you occupying gated-off sections of the map where you will either have to make your way to some objective on your own or follow behind an NPC while they divulge expository dialogue. The only real difference being these gated-off sections are much larger and often contain a bunch of side objectives that can be completed if you feel like exploring. Something that existed in the first games, albeit on a much smaller scale. Honestly, despite the dimensions of the area the story takes place in being orders of magnitude larger, the pace and method Metro uses for storytelling is almost unaltered. So if you're a fan of the Metro series but are a little hesitant to play Exodus based solely on its radically different look on the surface, trust me when I say the guts underneath that are almost exactly the same. That being said, if you do fall into that category, you may want to skip out on the next few bits of this video since I'll be spoiling events that take place after the game's first major area, which will definitely dip into spoiler territory. So if you don't want some really great story beats ruined for you, make sure to skip to the timestamp on screen, use the chapters, or click the link in the description. Early on in Exodus, Artyom's wife Anna falls into an old repository or maybe a disposal facility for radioactive material. An easy enough rescue for someone who's taken on an entire army of communists by himself, but the lingering effects of this situation will last for the entire game. And if you ask me, this is handled really well. Anna apparently contracted some kind of illness from her time in that old cave, and it's eating away at her lungs pretty rapidly. There are clues dropped here and there that her condition isn't the greatest, and maybe it'll be pretty obvious to some, but I was wrapped up in the other events of the story and didn't really see this one coming.
Still, this place is too hot. I feel I'm coming down soon, like Stepan.
Now, this wouldn't have been quite so impactful if we were dealing with the Anna we knew in Last Light, who could be summed up as, well, a fucking asshole. But in Exodus, she's a much more likable character. She's still got her edge and is more than willing to run into a situation guns blazing, but this time around she feels a little more human and relatable, and the same thing goes for her dad. Commander Miller was a badass in the previous games, but he was relatively simple as far as characters go. In Exodus, the guy goes through an actual arc. At first he feels justified in keeping his secret knowledge to himself since he thought it was his patriotic duty, but as the game goes on, he realizes what a fool he was. In fact, it was directly by his hand that the entire Ranger platoon was lured into a mountain base filled to the brim with cannibals because he believed the Russian government was actually hiding out there.
Women and children? Good. Haven't had those in a while.
Who are you?
Other members of the Rangers are given their own short development, and it really does round them out as characters. Not the entire squad gets this treatment, but they're all pretty likable. For the lucky ones who get a majority of the screen time, you can get more or less development from them based on the decisions you made in one area or another. Just like the two previous games, a morality system is always running in the background, and the points where your decisions matter won't exactly be outlined by a simple binary dialogue option like it's often handled in games. Instead, it runs off of your actual in-game actions.
Well, I'll be. He doesn't turn his satanic light on us. He's gone, he's holstered. He's a human after all, even though he is a heretic.
For example, you could easily kill your captors in the Taiga Valley. I mean, they have no problems killing you, but then again, they're just kids who never got a chance to grow up emotionally. And there's a similar conundrum in the desert surrounding the Caspian Sea. Some of the people looking to mess up your stealthing are just slaves following orders. All throughout the game, it keeps track of who you kill and don't and how you go about doing that, and I've always really appreciated morality systems like this. When a moral decision comes down to a binary dialogue choice, it's really easy to just look up each one's consequence, but when these decisions are constantly being delivered to you through actual gameplay, it's way more fun to engage with them. The ending of the game, or at least the good ending, to me feels a little too and everyone lived happily ever after, but just before you get to that point, the game delivers a massive gut punch by having Miller use the last of an experimental anti-drug on Artyom instead of himself. For some reason, I took this way harder than the possibility of Anna dying, and I'm not really sure why. Maybe it's because he sacrificed himself for me, or maybe it's because Miller's been in every entry in the series so far, but either way, this one really got to me. But we shouldn't dwell on the depressing stuff too long, so let's get the rest of the crew back in here and talk this thing out.
I just have to say, you were right, Artyom.
So Metro Exodus, in my opinion, offers the best, most engaging story in the series so far, and yes, that is a pretty bold claim. Of course, it would have never been able to accomplish that feat if the last two titles hadn't set up an amazing world and some truly memorable characters. But I think this is the most grand and unironically epic story to come out of the series. There are a few new characters introduced here, but most of the time is spent really working on the ones you already know. Everyone here is likable, or at least gets that way eventually, and the events of the game span a long swath of time and miles of territory. The Moscow Metro was an amazing place to set a story, but if you're like me, you spent a whole lot of time wondering what the rest of the world might look like after this nuclear apocalypse, and it's really satisfying finally getting to see it for yourself. I found it amazingly interesting how each member of the Metro adapted to life underground. Their routines, how they ate, and the inventions created to better suit these people to life in the tunnels, and that very same ingenuity is present across all of Russia in Exodus. Religious cults have sprung up, decrying the technology that led us all into wiping each other out. Vicious warlords have risen to power, enslaving people far too weak to fight back, and small pockets of children have been forced to grow up into adults using only the lessons from their teacher as a guide for how they should behave. And even more interestingly, other cities followed Moscow's example by slinking into the underground metro systems. And just for your information, these people were just as prone to acts of barbarism as anyone else after the bombs dropped. Without a doubt, all of these small, self-contained stories would have been enough to base a full game around, but we get these really interesting vertical slices of them in Exodus. Then, of course, you have the adorable camaraderie that develops between a paramilitary unit all stuffed in what might be the last working locomotive in Russia. All of these singular elements come together into what is an amazingly enjoyable and one that'll stick with you for a while. This time around, it'll take you more than twice the amount of time to get through compared to Last Light or 2033, and if you're not the most elite gamer out there, 4A includes a reader mode which significantly tones down the game's difficulty so you have less obstacles in between you and the game's story. A really cool idea if you ask me. This was one hell of a story and represents a trend that seems to be dying lately. Usually when a franchise blows up in popularity like this, you can expect a noticeable drop in quality in the name of getting more people on board, but this truly feels like a Metro story for Metro fans. Not some cheap cash grab, but a tale someone truly wanted to tell. I guess to sum all of this up, I'll say this. As far as we know, Exodus won't be the last entry in the Metro series, but to be honest, I'd be fine if it was.
Target acquired. Sabot ready. Fire! Fuck! Handle their own people!
Okay, so here comes the controversial stuff. Metro as a series kind of had its little niche carved out already. Punishing shooting mechanics coupled with even more punishing stealth mechanics, all taking place inside a very small, very linear space. And this is going to sound absolutely insane, but even though Exodus made the transition into a more open world style of gameplay, I'd say it retains nearly all of what I just described. I know that sounds crazy, but genuinely, the amount changed in the move from closed-off linear progression to open world is next to none. In the original Metro games, you'd find yourself led by the nose through the Russian subway system, and each station or tunnel you'd come across would act as one of three archetypes. You could either rub elbows with other citizens of the Metro, spending pre-war cartridges to upgrade your gear, engage in a stealth system where the odds are so stacked against you that your only option is staying hidden, or find yourself in heated open-air firefights with commies, Nazis, mutants, or sometimes all of the above. And lastly, there are the locations that are merely there for exposition's sake and world building, so you'll just basically be following an NPC who's talking about something that adds to the overall lore of the Metro. In a few instances, you may have found a combination of these three approaches together, but really in the old Metro games, this was just about all you could expect, and that's exactly what's going on here in Exodus. The scenery might be much more open, but the options remain roughly the same. The only problem is it'll be a bit hard to lay all this out in a way that makes sense, or at least one that makes sense to me, since this game is very segmented, so I guess let's break down those individual segments and see what they have to offer. The first real area once you leave Moscow is a stretch of quasi-marshlands by the Volga River. This is your first introduction to the game's new, more open-world approach and plays out a bit like a tutorial level. Once you leave the Aurora, you're stuck on a set course with Anna, which will lead you to your first stealth section, which is surprisingly difficult if you're playing on anything above normal. After that, most of the map is explorable, and you get a lot of the game's new mechanics introduced in a more or less organic sort of way. As you explore, you discover all kinds of out-of-the-way landmarks, and as you come across these places, Artyom's going to mark them down on his map, which maintains the game's immersive feel by existing inside the game world and not being relegated to a menu, something I always appreciate. From time to time, your fellow Spartans are going to get in touch to offer suggestions on where to go, but at this point, the order in which you do things is basically up to you. Dotting the map are mutant nests, camps, buildings, strongholds, or other things occupied by bandits or other human enemies, and things here are just like they were in the Metro. You can most definitely approach any situation with guns blazing, but oftentimes doing this risks collateral damage, which will really mess things up if you're looking to get the good ending. But on top of that, gunshots in this game really hurt, and on any difficulty, one or two will be more than enough to put you in the ground. Stealth this time around will be very familiar to Metro vets, with the only real addition being a new throwable trash item that can act as a distraction. On my first playthrough of this game, I neglected these old cans, and now that I've made proper use of them, I can say that was a massive mistake. Trust me, these things are useful as hell no matter what difficulty you're on, but especially if you're going for a less lethal approach. Speaking of additions, the old method of upgrading equipment isn't exactly going to work outside of Moscow, since pre-war cartridges only work as a currency in the Metro's tunnels where everyone sort of agreed on that standard. Here on the surface, things take on a more scavenging craft type of approach. Supplies in Exodus come in two varieties, chemical and material. They can be found all over the place and provide a great reward for venturing off the beaten path. Once you've gotten your hands on some crafting supplies, you can pull out your bag, which lets you craft tools, ammo, and alter your loadout on the fly, something I really love. In the early Metro titles, I always enjoyed tinkering with my firearms to make the best gun for a specific situation, and that's more present than ever here. Instead of diversifying your arsenal best for a variety of scenarios like you had to do in the last two games, Metro lets you tweak your guns whenever you want, so walking around with a silenced weapon that won't do much in a mutant fight is no longer an issue. You can swap out different types of barrels, scopes, suppressors, magazines, and buttstocks whenever you want, so you should never find yourself in an unwinnable situation, or at least not because of the guns you have on you. For those of you that never played them, the original Metro titles were great in letting you customize your gear, but you sort of had to know what situation you would be running into next, or else you could find yourself with a really bad loadout. So you either had to prepare a gun for every single scenario, be it stealth or outright action, or you had to have basic knowledge of what missions were coming next. Here in Exodus, let's say you're worried about running into mutants while exploring. Well, go ahead and gear up with the loudest, most powerful stuff you have, but if you happen to come across a bandit camp and they haven't spotted you yet, maybe take a second and apply some silencers or craft a few throwable knives for the situation. For me, the ability to customize my gear as the situation evolves is the absolute best thing Exodus brought to the series. I have always enjoyed when a shooting game lets me tinker with my arsenal, but the fact that I can do it on the fly and have so many options available really improves on what I used to think was perfection. New add-ons can be picked up out in the wild, whether that be some abandoned shotgun lying empty in a derelict camp, or one currently held in the death grip of some asshole you just plugged. When you come across a weapon, a little graphic shows up with a pickup prompt that'll highlight parts of the weapon that have been customized past the stock configuration, giving you a clear idea of what you'll get from either equipping it there on the spot or breaking it down for parts, ammo, and materials. Damn, that ended up being a bit of an out-of-the-way tangent. I just wanted to talk about weapons and customization. Anyways, the starting area is a great, ease you into things sort of intro to both the new and old Metro mechanics on offer here, but I think it's the next major section that's my favorite.
Artyom, a car!
After leaving the Volga River, the seasons change and the Spartan troop comes across a massive desert that has sprung up off the shores of the Caspian Sea, and to me this feels like the part of the game that got the most attention and subsequently gives you the most freedom. This arid plot of land is really damn big and offers something to explore or examine for nearly every square inch of it. Here the goal is to get water for both the Aurora and your team, who are mostly all being ravaged by the effects of exhaustion, dehydration, and heat stroke. Sadly, a local warlord known only as the Baron has developed a monopoly on the water supply here and as such runs a type of brutal slave-based raider kingdom and maybe an amateur radio broadcasting system.
Listen up, everyone! The Baron is about to speak! Listen up, everyone! The Baron is speaking!
Because this section is so much larger than the last, early on you come across a godsend in the form of a post-apocalyptic Mad Max-style automobile. Using this thing to crisscross the map is fun as hell, and it handles in a way that feels really true to life. I mean, it's not racing sim levels of realism, but it bumps around and sways pretty convincingly. But best of all, you can use it to run over the local mutant population, which is a 10 out of 10 experience. You can come across some of the Baron's strongholds, aka slave camps, and free their captives. There are random sandstorms that can come and go, forcing you to find shelter, and I guess we should probably talk about the day-to-night cycle. Dotted throughout the map are little safe houses you can find with workbenches allowing you to customize and, more importantly, clean your weapons, but you can also get a little shut-eye here as well. The reason being, you may not want to attempt a stealth raid on an enemy camp under the blinding light of the desert sun. There is a catch though. If you happen to be out there on foot in the pitch black night, you'll notice mutants are way more active, and it's not exactly uncommon to find yourself getting picked up by a flying demon you didn't know was overhead. This threw in a nice bit of added complexity to these sections, as I would notice the sun going down and sort of instinctively check my map for the nearest safe house to hold up in for the night. There are scripted story missions to be done here, which will gate you into one small section of the map for their duration, and these are a great little return to Metro orthodoxy when the whole open world thing starts to wear on you. But sadly, all good things must come to an end, and after toppling the Baron's slave-based empire, the crew heads on to the Taiga Valley. which acts as a kind of return to the more linear and curated style Metro was known for. Not wanting another scenario like they ran into in the desert, Miller sends Artyom and Alyosha ahead to scout the area before they commit to driving several tons of train through it. And that turned out to be a pretty smart move, since the two almost immediately fall prey to some kind of landslide and are rescued by a woman belonging to a cool little group who have carved out a primitive life for themselves here in the valley. Before the bombs dropped, these guys were attending a children's summer camp in the area, and for whatever reason, ended up being nearly the only people left. They were raised and taught by one of the camp's teachers and have taken to treating their dead teacher as a bit of a deity. This part of the game is a mostly linear stealth section, offering only a few instances where you can venture off and explore some side areas, aka exactly what you would find in Metro 2033 or Last Light.
Thanks, bro. Just untie me now.
There's also a group of bandits who have recently set up camp too, but mostly you'll be sneaking around and knocking out guards as opposed to getting into open-air gunfights, which is good because the game takes away all your guns. This part of the game has a persistent boss fight in the form of a massive mutated bear, which is fun enough, but ends up being more of an ammo dump than anything. Since this part of the game is much shorter than the two previous open world maps, the amount of detail you'll find in every square inch of the valley is staggering, and even though it's short and not as engaging from a gameplay sense as the stuff that came before it, this valley's pretty damn memorable regardless. I'm sure series vets have noticed by now that we've omitted one section of the game, and that's because it contains story spoilers, but just to condense things down, it's a really fun linear action section that requires you to shoot a lot, and it's really well made. I just don't have a lot to say about it. Anyways, once they've made it out of the valley, the crew ends up in, oh god, here's hoping I'm saying this right, Novosibirsk? Hopefully that's right, or as the game calls it, the Dead City. Well, let's stick with that. This section of Exodus is a bit of an homage to the style of gameplay and setting that Metro fans cut their teeth on. The city, for some reason, is flooded with much higher levels of radiation than what the crew was used to in Moscow, forcing you to limit the amount of time you spend topside. But overall, the way you traverse this area will be very familiar to veteran Metro players, which means you'll be mostly progressing through claustrophobic train tunnels, listening to an NPC deliver exposition, and taking part in heavily scripted set-piece style events. You're not going to have to worry about any human threats, as nearly all of this Metro's inhabitants died in some kind of internal conflict, so it's back to taking shots at mutants, which in this part of Russia sort of resembles that long-nosed, mole-looking Nosalis from the very first release of 2033. Towards the end, you get to take part in a small stealth section where you try to avoid being caught by this abomination, which looks a lot like the librarians from Moscow, only blind and maybe psychic? And really, that's the totality of what Exodus has to offer. So maybe now you're getting an idea why I was saying it might be a little hard to succinctly summarize all of this. While you could technically say Metro Exodus is a far cry from your average Metro experience thanks to its big open world maps, you'd be just as correct in saying this game stays mostly true to the original style of gameplay seen in the previous entries. Half of the game's 4 major sections are large open world maps, and the other half are linear callbacks to 2033 and Last Light, and you know what? I love them both equally. When this game first started making the pre-release media rounds, I was very apprehensive to see the series I love turned into something different. I've never really been a big fan of open world games in general, to be honest, but outside of that, I just didn't want to see a franchise I already got into making sweeping changes to a style I was already fond of. Hell, even if I loved open world titles, I would still be worried that implementing a curated linear experience into that kind of a framework would result in an unrecognizable mess. I really can't overstate how worried I was about this new move into uncharted territory, and admittedly, I went into this game with a lot of doubt. In fact, I was so worried that I didn't want to risk spending a good $60 on the thing. Thank God for good friends willing to give out their Epic Games Store login. But by the time I had seen the closing credits, I was blown away at how engrossed I was. Exodus really pulled off something impressive here. The game plays exactly like the last games did, despite being designed in a way you'd assume would make that impossible. Shooting feels tight and impactful, just like I remembered, and getting into a real-deal firefight was a butt-tightening experience with only a few hits standing between me and an early grave. Oh, and speaking of early graves, unlike the last games, Exodus lets you quick save, and for most of the game this won't be the biggest addition, but once you've messed up a small portion of a very long stealth section, you'll come to appreciate just how big of an improvement it was. Continuing with the compliments, the mutants I had such a hard time downing in 2033 are now a perfect combination of hard-hitting and killable. The stealth felt so much more polished and challenging, and the weapon customization was on a whole new level of satisfying. This game truly perfected the elements that I first fell in love with Metro's first entries, and because of that, I think it might be my absolute favorite in the series. Now, does that have anything to do with the fact that it's basically a mashup of Stalker and Metro? Well, I'm gonna say no, but just know that I'm nodding my head yes.
What is this dog?
That being said, there are most definitely a few flaws to mention, so let's start with the most petty and least impactful. So this is weird, but I sort of hate how much Exodus makes you hold down the interact button. In the first two games, interacting with nearly anything could be done with a single quick press of the E key, but during scenes like opening a stuck door or turning a crank, you might have to hold it down or maybe mash it sometimes. And I think that was a perfect way to handle stuff. But here in Exodus, most of the things you interact with require that button to stay held down for an arbitrary amount of time. Now, I could understand this coming into play when coming across a weapon because you have a few options there, but realistically, this is another aspect of the game that was perfected in the previous releases. Back in those titles, you could either press the interact key once to take ammo from a weapon or hold it down to swap your current gun with it. In Exodus, though, you either hold interact to take the weapon or hold reload to break it down for parts. And honestly, I just don't get it. Why make us sit here for an extra second holding down a button that used to work perfectly as a single quick press? This doesn't add anything to the game, and during shootouts, it can get you killed. This one small mechanic actively works against the flow of the game, which otherwise is really smooth. Now, this obviously isn't a reason to put the game down or anything, but it really stands out since most other decisions in Exodus were clearly made with the intention of improving things, but this one little interact button seems to almost always be a net negative. For an example of something on the opposite end of that spectrum, the throwing knife no longer kills when it hits an extremity like an arm or a leg. Now at first that may sound like a downgrade, and I understand why, but it actually adds another notch of satisfying difficulty, and admittedly it was always a little funny seeing a guy slump over dead because I managed to jam a knife into his calf. Another pet peeve of mine that didn't exist in 2033 or Last Light is the invisible stamina gauge in Exodus. You can only run for a very short burst of time in this game, and going over that will have you unable to sprint for a bit, and more annoyingly, it blurs your vision until you recover. Now, had this have existed in the narrow tunnels of the originals, it would make more sense. In those games, you were rarely ever more than 2 or 3 feet away from the nearest wall, so a short sprint distance, while being unneeded, would be a little more understandable. But taking away the player's ability to sprint for long distances, in a game where the devs significantly increase the distance they'll have to cover on foot, I don't know, it seems like an open act of aggression to me. For me, this limitation never played into the difficulty or how I approached the game, and it only ever served as an annoyance until I got my vehicle in the desert. I truly can't think of a reason they would have included this other than the fact that it was just what other shooters were doing at the time, and that really sucks. And finally, the absolute biggest issue here is one that, unlike the previous two, might noticeably and significantly affect your average playthrough. Now, this is going to sound very crazy at first, but I swear it's true. Enemies in Exodus on very rare occasions will turn incorporeal and become essentially immune to gunfire. You might have your sights directly lined up with the dead center of your enemy's chest, and when you hit that fire button, you may notice that they didn't take even the smallest amount of damage. In fact, you may have noticed that I have hit markers on, which is a little odd for me because I always turn off HUD elements and other stuff that'll take me out of the experience, but I keep them on for this exact reason. On my first playthrough, a significant amount of damage I took was from enemies I had just scored a dead center headshot on. Now, I assume this isn't as simple as just making the enemies not take damage for difficulty's sake. By my best guess, this is caused by the way the engine tracks animation. Kind of like once an animation triggers, while the enemy may still be visually in a certain position, they are counted as being somewhere else by the engine. which I think translates into the engine is too far ahead of the video output, or maybe vice versa. This one small issue can really creep into your playthrough and start bothering you, but mostly because otherwise this is some of the best shooting I've ever done in a video game. Guns kick with almost haptic feedback, and the sound design makes each shot feel and sound really powerful. Add that together with some really convincing dynamic animations based on where you shoot the enemy, and you have some incredibly satisfying shooting mechanics. You just might have to deal with some real jank for maybe 5% of the time. Other than those 3 issues though, this may as well be a perfect game. Even when I discount how surprised I was that this format worked in a Metro game, everything here just seems really well thought out and intentionally designed. It's also a much longer playthrough than the games that came before it, and somehow pacing seems to be unaffected. An average run of Exodus might take you a good 15 to 18 hours to complete, but speaking from experience, it's not hard to get caught up with exploration and side content, stretching that out to nearly twice as long. To date, I've put nearly 100 hours into this thing, and I don't foresee something keeping me from starting a new game again at some point this year and further contributing to that. If you're a die-hard fan with the first 2 Metro games, believe me, I can understand if you're feeling apprehensive of the big changes that come with this newer entry, but believe me when I say that same irradiated heart beats inside of this thing. It is without a doubt a classic Metro experience through and through, and if you're having trouble translating that, it means this game is amazing. While 2033 and Last Light were titles that sort of fit into a more niche genre, I think 4A brought that into a more accessible sector of games and somehow managed to have it stay faithful to those original entries. But regardless of whether or not you're a fan of those titles, this is a game you need to check out. If not for the incredible gameplay, then for the absolute adorableness of the humanimals when they think they're hiding from you by pressing themselves flat against a wall in broad daylight. From its earliest inception, Metro was known for pushing the envelope in terms of presentation. 4A showed a massive love for realistic and impressive real-time dynamic light sources, and a staggering attention to detail that was as praiseworthy as it was rare. So it's no surprise that Metro Exodus follows that trend perfectly. Since the release of the Redux versions of 2033 and Last Light, 4A have made some dead serious tweaks to their in-house game engine to the point that it's nearly unrecognizable. Now that you'll find yourself in more biomes than just snowy post-apocalypse, all kinds of new effects are possible, and each of them show that signature 4A obsessive charm. The harsh desert sun has a blinding brightness to it, and when going from shaded areas to well-lit ones, you'll see a kind of faux HDR effect come into play. There are noticeable god rays when bright light sources get broken up by objects in the foreground, and as usual, this effect always has me stopping in my tracks to appreciate it. The individual light shafts themselves have this sort of blurring effect on the things it gets cast on, and man, this looks really believable. Other than the lighting though, which is honestly to die for, character models are much more detailed, with all kinds of little accessories, wrinkles, and other decals being very realistic looking. Okay, so this next thing is going to be a very odd thing to focus on, which shouldn't surprise anyone who's been around this channel for a while, but I actually sort of got a kick out of how soft and realistic Colonel Miller's hair and beard looked. Seriously, it looks like you could just reach out and feel his thin-ass old man hair. I love it. Getting off of the fetishistic stuff, your weapons look amazingly high resolution, and make sure to keep that same Metro visual design. Basically meaning they look like much better looking versions of their old 2033 and Last Light iterations. Plus, there are new add-ons that can be found for each gun, and these follow that same basic design language. There's a lot of exposed electronics and signs that things were soldered or welded together right there on the spot. Very Metro looking. All over Exodus, but specifically with the firearms, there are signs that these guys really paid attention to every minute detail you could think of. Hell, your gun barrels even glow white hot when you've been firing them for prolonged periods. Speaking of details, facial animations are so much better looking than what we've previously seen with the series. Characters have these very believable expressions, and this really helps sell the more emotional scenes. What really impressed me though was the fact that the draw distance is so vast you can basically see from one end of the map to the other with little to no issue as long as the weather is clear. Although I should mention you are going to pay a price for this. In scenes where a lot of the map is visible, you'll see frame rates tank pretty noticeably, which is never fun. But a real kick in the gut is the fact that the place where this is most prevalent is the very first open map you get to. In the Volga, you can see the frame rate drop by as much as 20% just because you're looking in the direction of the Aurora. Similarly, in the desert, looking at enemy outposts with a lot of people in them can lead to a noticeable drop as well. Maybe not as severe as in the Volga, but it'll still mess with that smooth experience you'll get the other 99% of the time. Really, I could go on and on about how good this game looks, but I don't think I should have to. If you could see all the footage I put in the video so far, you should be able to tell that without my help. Honestly, this may be one of the most impressive visual packages I've seen since the refinement of Capcom's RE engine in RE2 and 3 Remake. Of course, I am a picky little shit, and I absolutely will not pass up an opportunity to complain, so here's some of the stuff I didn't like so much. Number 1 on that list, with a massive circle around it, being the inclusion of screen space reflections, an effect that can look okay maybe 20% of the time when lighting and angles are all perfectly aligned, but most of the time looks like a speckled, grainy mess. I've never been a fan of these fake reflections because of how much worse scenes can look when in motion, and just like the 2 Capcom titles I mentioned before, you can really mess with how bad they look by seeing them at weird angles. For instance, see the reflection there in the water? Well, look what happens when I have the absolute gall to walk up these stairs and see it from a different angle. Sadly, this game doesn't give me any control over turning these on or off, which isn't the worst thing in the world. Like I said, they can look good sometimes, but I'd say most of the time you might as well not have them around if given the choice. In some scenarios, you might see the same shadow banding issue from the first 2 games at work, only this time they're vertically oriented, and I'm not really sure if that counts as an improvement or not. I also had a problem with some shadows sort of dancing around off in the distance, and I'm not really sure what causes this. In fact, getting close up and looking at it now, it might actually be screen space reflections messing up, but again, I'm not really sure. Some 2D textures can have a sort of Z-fighting type effect where they disappear depending on how close you are to them, but that's relatively rare. And since I spent so much time talking shit about screen space reflections, we should probably talk about the most recent version of Metro Exodus released, which sort of answers that problem. The Enhanced Edition is a brand new reworking of the game's lighting system that strips out all of the old lighting tech and replaces it with a brand new ray tracing implementation. A very cool move by 4A in my opinion. This new tech is really interesting right now, and it's awesome to see its implementation in a free update that doesn't replace the original, at least on Steam anyways. So that should be it, right? Company does right by the fans by including new tech free of charge, and yes, that's awesome to see, but my real issue is with ray tracing itself, specifically ray tracing as it exists right now. For those of you out of the loop, ray tracing is a brand new method developers can use to imitate realistic lighting conditions and light behavior. Given the right use case, ray tracing can look stunning, but here's where things start to stick. It is incredibly taxing on current-gen hardware. So why is that? Well, to simplify things to an insulting degree, ray tracing basically needs to be applied to every single on-screen pixel that can interact with light. And sure, that makes total sense why it'd be such a drain on resources. I mean, it is still a relatively new phenomenon, and I don't expect hardware developers to constantly be caught up with the software side of things. Besides, applying literally anything to every single on-screen pixel in a game that might be running at 1440p or 4K, it's gonna tax anything. So when you break this all down, other than great looking lighting, ray tracing essentially means to an end user trading massive levels of performance for, and here's the real kicker, what can often be barely noticeable visual gains. Don't believe me? Well, here's Exodus, both regular and RTX Enhanced Edition, side by side. Now, I'm not going to label which one is which, and I want you to tell me. Can you tell a considerable difference between the two other than very slight shifts in brightness? How about here? For those of you paying attention, yes, the only real tangible difference between these two images is the huge hit to frame rate when using ray tracing. Of course, the Enhanced Edition does include DLSS, a type of smart tech that can dynamically lower or raise the internal operating resolution on the fly as performance dictates, and that's awesome. especially for lower end systems and console hardware. Really revolutionary shit without a doubt, I mean truly, but this stuff is even necessary on my gaming PC, which is rocking a Ryzen 9 3900 and an RTX 3080 Ti. And call me crazy, but I don't think one of, if not the absolute most powerful GPU that any human being can physically get their hands on should be struggling with your 4-year-old video game. It's the crisis effect all over again, where software developers are so far ahead of the hardware, they're releasing games that aren't supposed to run well on the stuff that exists today, but on theoretical tech that may or may not be invented. But let's word this a little differently. If you've created an awesome new lighting method, but it requires you to noticeably lower the resolution you enjoy your games at, can we really call that a benefit? And listen, it's not like this is one of those only Jared would notice things. You can really tell when the game starts manipulating resolution, and sometimes even the most mundane scenes will be looking blurry as hell. A few times while playing Enhanced Edition, I felt like there was something in my eyes, and then I'd realize it's because everything on screen looks like it's been smeared with Vaseline. Hey, look at that, I'm a poet and don't know it. Make a rhyme every time. So I guess here's what I'm trying to say. Ray tracing as a concept is very fun, very interesting, and even more exciting, but having to use DLSS in RT-ready games just to get playable frame rates is the opposite of all that. It's not bad or bad looking, it's just not there yet in my opinion, and really the point of all this was to explain why I wouldn't be using footage from the Enhanced Edition in this video very much. Which means you'll primarily be seeing and have seen footage of the good old regular release of Exodus here, and until new technology learns how to play nice with top-of-the-line hardware and very meager video settings, that's going to be an attitude that follows me into any new game release. Although I will be honest, the Enhanced Edition including an FOV slider is nearly enough of a reason for me to jump ship. But after every scripted scene, the field of view has to adjust itself, so maybe I'm better off sticking to my guns. But I guess getting back to the actual point of this section, Metro Exodus is drop-dead gorgeous despite any of my complaints. Getting back into the game for this video, I found myself remembering just how impressive it all is. And sure, maybe looking better than 2033 or Last Light isn't too hard, those are old games at this point, but doing so while rendering out miles of in-game real estate and including dynamic lights that'll make you moisten any pair of pants you might be wearing, well that is without a doubt worthy of praise. In their next usage of this engine, I hope 4A iron out some of the performance issues that can creep up in select scenarios, but all of that aside, this is easily one of the best looking video games I've seen in years. Those of you who have been around for a while know I can be very hard to please with stuff like this, and well, you can officially consider me very pleased here. But we've only covered one possible aspect of this visual package. Metro Exodus made it to all the big boy consoles of its day, and even the current gen offerings got its Enhanced Edition. And I just so happened to have finally joined that party by getting myself a PS5 earlier in the week, so I feel like a little christening is in order. Alright, so I am pretty stoked to have finally joined the modern gaming landscape now that I own a PS5, but there's still a tiny issue gumming up the works. See, I got all excited about having a brand new console at the house, but I sort of forgot I don't own any 4K displays. I kinda stuck with the middle ground in the resolution wars, aka 1440p, and unlike the Series X, the PS5 just doesn't support that. On top of that, the fastest display I have only hits a meager 100 Hz, so I won't be able to test any higher frame rates as well, which means we're gonna have to look at this port at a mere 1080p 60. Now, for all I know, this may positively affect performance or negatively affect the game's visuals, but I really won't be able to confirm that till I get a better monitor, so just be aware of that going forward. Alright, so with the boring stuff out of the way, the first thing I was interested in checking with this port was performance, and while there were some notable areas of slowdown, I can't exactly be upset since they were all taking place in the very same areas I would see them in the PC port. And to be honest, during gameplay they felt way less severe, mostly because I was running such a higher frame rate on PC. If that sounds unintuitive, believe me, a jump from 100 frames per second to 50 will be almost game-breaking, but from 60 to 50, really not that big of a deal. All that aside though, this version of the game looks amazing and almost always runs at a perceivably smooth frame rate. Since the Exodus Enhanced Edition was developed specifically to take advantage of newer consoles' ray-tracing-ready hardware, this PS5 port includes all of the great-looking ray-traced light sources you could ever want. And just to reiterate my comments about ray-tracing from before, it looks amazing, it just doesn't look that much more amazing than how the game already looked. That being said, I almost did a double take while capturing this footage. See, I had been under the impression that this release was built from the ground up around ray tracing, but here I was seeing obvious signs of screen space reflections. And for those of you that don't know, ray-traced reflections look incredible. The difference between the two methods for real-time reflections are very obvious when you know what to look for. So I did some digging, and everything I found kept pointing towards the same talking points. This version of Exodus is going to be revolutionary, full support for ray tracing, and all the usual clueless console fanboy nonsense. Which, if anything, should really open your eyes to the non-tech savvy journalists you get your gaming news from. This is a major component of ray tracing, and the only people who seemed to notice that it wasn't present during gameplay were regular people who had similar questions to me after playing it themselves. So I kept digging until I found a press release directly from 4A, and even then it was sort of a fluke. Somehow I had accidentally clicked on Google's image search instead of a web search, and right there was an image macro letting me know that Exodus on PS5 and Xbox did not support ray-traced reflections or DLSS. Now, that's no underhanded dig at the console versions of Exodus. Like I said, these are brand new graphical tricks and they can have a noticeable impact on frame rate, but I'm more amazed at how long it took me to find this among the ocean of news articles talking about this very subject. I know this is not going to be a new concept for a lot of you, but for the rest, maybe think about keeping a modicum of skepticism about yourself when getting information from games journalists. If this situation has taught me anything, it's that a lot of them are just repeating to you stuff that they've heard, and their sources are often equally uninformed games journalists. On the plus side though, they are still a great source of information regarding which Grand Theft Auto games are the most sexist, so it's not all bad news. Moving on, I found the new options included in the Enhanced Edition made me wish I'd put a little more time into its PC counterpart, specifically the option to increase the in-game field of view. In vanilla, I wouldn't exactly say it was a claustrophobic FOV, but any control over that setting at all is always going to be a win in my book, and with that in mind, the wider FOV here is absolutely gorgeous. You can see so much more of the environment around you, and it's even a little better for gameplay as your watch containing your visibility meter and waypoint guide is visible even when you have your weapon at the low ready. For most people, I would say an FOV change isn't going to be something that's immediately noticeable, but trust me, when you see the two options back to back, it is pretty radical. Besides all the technical stuff though, the game played well enough for me. I did have some issues hitting targets while shooting, but then again, I am famously bad at playing shooters with a controller, so you could probably chalk that up to me just being a keyboard and mouse guy. All in all, this was a pretty amazing time, or at least it was up to the very first section of the Volga, where I found I absolutely could not get the boat I was supposed to take to break away from where it was docked. I tried jumping into it, shooting it, or just brute forcing the damn thing, but for all intents and purposes, I was soft locked. This is a necessary part of the game's progression, and until I trigger the next scene, I can't continue the game's story, meaning I'm stuck here. So I ran around what was accessible to me and got some footage, but I found that none of the boats here seemed to want to cooperate as well. So I googled the problem and found a lot of people saying that quitting to the main menu and reloading your save should fix it, but I had no luck with that either. I even power cycled my console, and to my surprise, when I loaded that save up, it was still stuck right there at the pier. I've got to assume that starting a new game on a new save will solve this issue, but I'm not about to play through the beginning of this game again to test that. It's already burned me once, and I'm not coming back for seconds. So while I can't definitively say this will also happen to you, just know it's a possibility on a brand new PS5 with an up-to-date version of Metro Exodus on it. And that's a damn shame, because I was massively impressed with how well this game ran and handled up to that point. I was right off the bat ready to name this the best console port I could test, but I really can't make that claim now. It certainly is a sad state of affairs, but let's look at the PS4 version and see if we can actually progress past the start of the game. Man, talk about a low bar to clear.
Artyom, stop putting delusions into his head. I don't want him going crazy like you.
The standard non-RTX, non-enhanced edition of Exodus on PS4 outputs 1080p and targets 30 frames per second, and I've gotta say from the start, I was really feeling that frame rate. Maybe it has something to do with this port, or me just going straight from two releases that stay at or above 60 FPS, but either way, this was really hard for me to play. I was missing shots all over the place, and with the slower frame rate, I think the issue with enemies allowing bullets to pass right through them is much worse. So I know I should probably talk about this port more before I say this, but without a doubt, this should not be your first choice if you have any other method for playing Exodus. Moving on from that damning start, I was actually pretty surprised to see that the lighting and overall visual fidelity didn't receive any kind of a noticeable bump down in quality. With the last two games in the series, the console versions had pretty noticeable portions of their presentations dialed back to accommodate slightly lower end hardware, but here I couldn't see a single thing other than the frame rate that was altered. Speaking of that nasty frame rate again, I found the weird animation ghosting issue I originally talked about in 2033 is present here too. And if you don't feel like watching an entire video to figure out what the hell I'm talking about, it's this weird Street Fighter Alpha style shadow that this needle leaves behind when it moves. Imagine this, but applied to everything that physically moves within the game. From what I can tell, Exodus will run at 1440p within a 4K window on the PS4 Pro, but I am pretty sure it retains the 30 FPS lock, so I wouldn't assume you would get a better experience with the more powerful hardware. Continuing with the beating here, I found a good deal of screen tearing in busy scenes, something that honestly is a little worse feeling than a slow frame rate. On that same note, this port seemed to stutter a lot, with some frames seeming to hang around for a lot longer than they should. It being so close to parity with the PC release, the PS4 version shares screen space reflections, and if you thought them being a little less clear was going to help them look better, you are dead wrong. And last of my complaints, the load times here can be just annoyingly long. I am almost positive that one load screen lasted more than 5 minutes while I was getting this footage. Now, realistically, long load times aren't the worst thing in the world as long as that loading happens on its own screen and doesn't take resources from gameplay, which luckily is the case here. But I imagine people quick saving and loading a lot to deal with the poor performance's effect on gameplay will really feel the effects of this. Sadly though, the game struggling with load times is going to seem like a fun little feature when I tell you I ran into the same exact problem I had on PS5. Yep, the first boat in the Volga did not move from the shore when I tried to take it, making this game, at least for me, uncompletable on both platforms I tested outside of sequence breaking tech that'll have you getting near the church, falling in the water, and spawning inside of it. And I truly don't understand what's causing this. I mean, both versions were bought and downloaded straight from the PlayStation Store like any of the other games I have stored digitally, but for some reason this game-breaking problem persists across two console generations for me. Of course, I can't confirm that this isn't just something odd going on my end only, but a quick Twitter poll tells me at least some of you guys have seen the same issue. And because of that, I can't in good conscience recommend anyone get any digital Sony port of Metro Exodus. This of course may just be a fluke, but the last thing I want is for one of you to see this video and purchase something you can't play for reasons outside of your control. But besides game-breaking jank, I really wasn't impressed with Exodus on PS4. The Switch versions of both previous games had a similar frame rate, and for whatever reason I found them to be infinitely more playable. So I guess take that for what it is. I can't exactly rule out me sucking at video games as a possible explanation, but I think something else might be going on here. Regardless of what's at fault though, I really can't recommend this port of Exodus if you can help it. I know not everyone has access to a decent gaming PC, and the newer consoles are still an absolute ass to get a hold of, but even with that in mind, this does not feel like a good enough experience to warrant a playthrough. The entire time I was getting footage, it felt like an uphill struggle, and everything was kicking my ass despite the fact that I had it set to normal. So again, if you can help it, maybe stay away from the Xbox One/PS4 generation for this one, and unless you like rolling the dice, maybe just stick with a PC for Exodus. Like I said, you may be able to discount my experience as being anecdotal, but until I see otherwise, I have to assume at least a portion of you will have the same struggle, and to be honest, I can't really recommend a game port that won't let you play it. Man, that was a bit weird, but port issues aside, this game was really something. Like I already mentioned, I was not confident Exodus would capture me the same way its predecessors did, but holy hell am I glad I was wrong. Exodus really grabbed a hold of me and offered what I might call a better, more robust experience than the titles that came before it, and believe me, to someone like me who's already prone to becoming a fanboy and not being too accepting of change, the concept of saying something like that is crazy, but I swear it's true. Of course, I most definitely loved exploring the narrow tunnels of the Metro before, but Exodus gives me that same exact feeling when snooping around a map that's nearly 100 times larger. If you ask me, the fact that so much of the Metro fanbase seems to align with me on that idea makes for one hell of a sales pitch. It's like, hey, do you want to try a brand new first-person shooter? No? Well, what if it somehow convinced a large portion of its unpleasable fan base to be down with it majorly changing the series' blueprints? Now all of a sudden it sounded a lot better. But regardless of who you are, old vet or prospective fan, Exodus is well worth a play, but even more than that, I think it's earned a place in the series. It deserves to have the title of Metro on its box, and man, talk about a great game to end on. Of course, the series doesn't seem to be showing any signs of stopping, but until a new entry hits the scene, this will have to be it for this retrospective. And with that in mind, I am very thankful you guys followed me into this one. I know I've been going through a bit of a first-person shooter phase lately, and a lot of you understandably came here for my coverage of polar opposite series like Resident Evil and Silent Hill. I truly appreciate you guys still enjoying my content, even when I'm not covering survival horror titles, although you definitely haven't seen the last of that on the channel. But I think that's about all I have to say for now. So until next time, stay safe and happy hunting, stalkers. Well, hello friends. Thanks so much for making it to the end on this one. If you like this video or you're looking to support more projects like the Metro Retrospective, I'll have my Patreon linked on screen, and getting any of the games from my Good Old Games links will kick a little bit back to me as well. If you're looking for a little less commitment, a like and a comment will do just fine, but besides that, I'm just glad you guys are here. I've been getting a lot of love lately, and I want you all to know that the support does not go unappreciated. I hope all of you have as good of a day as you've given me, and I will most definitely see you guys again next time.